Hey guys, good morning. Today I would like to discuss about locking. What are the types of lockings we have in Pega? How can you configure locking? Where do you find the locks that are still there? How to release a lock? How to acquire a lock using out-of-the-box activities or methods? Okay, so these things we are going to discuss. So let's start with what is locking. So what is locking? Let's take a scenario like you purchased an item in Flipkart, okay, and you placed a return or an exchange. You raised a ticket to Flipkart asking for a return or an exchange. Now, the Flipkart customer support employees will start working on your ticket. Assume that two or more people were trying to work on your ticket at the same time. Okay, one person has opened your ticket and he was trying to place a request for return. At the same time, another person has opened a ticket and he was trying to put some message asking you like, why don't you exchange it? Okay. Now what happens? One of the person will submit the screen first and his data gets committed. Immediately the next person submits. So the next, again, this data also gets committed. So the first person's information is overridden by the second person's information because more than one person is working on the same case at the same time. So there's loss of data. This might happen in many scenarios. Okay, maybe you have sent a leave approval, okay, to a manager. So I assume that this can be approved by one or more managers. Okay, just assume that. Now what happens? One person might say yes, another person may say no, and again the data is lost. Any one of the person's opinion might get saved into your DB. So this way, if you do not have a lock or a control over the case, more than one person can work on it, and there's a chance that the data might be lost. So you need to get a lock. Only one person should have access to the case at one time, one point of time. And locking is always at thread level, means a one browser tab. Okay, so locking is always acquired at a thread level. So this is what is locking is. Locking is nothing but getting a control over a case so that only you can work on it at a point of time and no other person can work on it until and unless you release the case or release the lock. Okay, so where are locks configured in PRPC? So how do you create a case in PRPC? You give a button to the user, the user clicks on the button and the case creates. But what is the backend code? You have a class. Classes will have work objects, or your work objects are nothing but the instance of your classes, right? So you have to configure locks in the class rule form if you want to configure or get locks on your work objects. Okay, because your work objects are instances of classes, you have to put the locking on your classes. That's one level of configuring the locking. So where do you configure a lock? Let's take any class. Let me take this class approval. Right click on the class and set definition. The class rule opens. Do you find any option to give a lock here in any of the tabs? No, I don't find it. Then where am I going to configure the lock? Locking can be configured in a class rule form if and only if the class is a class group. If you say the class is a class group, then here a tab gets enabled called as locking, and you can put the lock details in that class group rule. Okay, but if it's belong to a class group, you have to put your lock in the class group class. Okay, so in my case, this class belongs to a class group, which is this one. So just click and open the class group rule. Oh, sorry, 1 second. It's trying to create something new. Refresh. Okay, so this is my class group to which my class belongs to. Let me open this. In this, you see there's a tab called as locks. In the locks tab, you can specify what your lock is a combination of. See, a lock is nothing but you're just trying to put a primary key in a locks table, saying that this case is currently locked by this person. So by default, the primary key that Pega generates is a combination of class name and the case ID. But if you want to customize it, you want to give a combination of various other parameters. You can give the properties here, like what all properties combination you want to give, you can specify. Just for example, I'm selecting something. Okay, but by chance, if you want to give like that, you can give something like this. Otherwise, the regular combination of the keys is class name plus the case ID. Okay, so this is the place where you have to configure the locks. And when you say allow locking, only when you give allow locking, you can get a lock on this work objects of this class. Otherwise, you can't get locking on the work objects of this class. So this is the place where you usually have to configure locking. If you don't configure it, if you just need to enable this and leave this empty, Pega will by default take the class name plus the key as a lock. So whenever you create a case, or when you're trying to perform some action on the case, you're trying to modify the case, approve the case, or you're trying to make some changes on the case, you get a lock on it. So how do you know that you have a lock, or what is the Pega's out of the box property that holds your lock data? The property is px lock handle. Just open your clipboard, go to PY work page. This is the property and this is the lock value. So it is class name plus the the PY ID or the case ID. That is your key for your lock. So whenever you open your case, if you want to see the lock value, just go to PY work page, search for the property px lock handle, you'll find it. Okay. And where does Pega store these logs? How does Pega get to know like the person is having a log or the lock is released? How does this happen? There's an out of the box table called as PR underscore sys underscore logs. This is an out of the box table where Pega stores the logs acquired by the users. Okay, so just query this table. You'll find this data like when was the lock acquired, who is the name of what is the name of the person, from which system. Usually system IDs in real time are like dev, QA, UAT, production. So from which system this lock was expired and what is the expiry date time. Why do you need to have an expiry date in time? Say I acquired a lock, okay, and what did I do? I started working on the case. Suddenly I thought, okay, it's lunch break, let me go for lunch. I went for lunch. I took an hour. In the meanwhile, somebody was trying to work on the same case, but I have a lock on it. And I did not release it. I just locked my system and went for lunch. It's locked. Then again, I thought like, okay, let me go and play some TT. I went for playing TT. I didn't come for an hour again. So 2 hours. The case is still locked by me. And the other person who is willing to work on the case cannot work on the case because it's locked by me. So you need to set some time, expiry time. Okay. You need to put some expiry time so that the lock gets released automatically after certain amount of time. Otherwise, what happens? The other person who is willing to work on the case cannot work on it until and unless you close the case in your browser or you log off from your system. Okay, so you have to put some time. Usually, the default time that Pega gives is 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, the lock gets auto released if you're not still accessing the case. So you can see this. I have acquired the lock on 49. So 30 minutes is the default expiry time that is allocated by Pega. And remember one thing, a lock do not get released if the user just simply closes the browser window and leaves. So let's say I have opened a case, okay? If I close the case, the lock gets released. If I log off from the system by clicking log off in your PRPC window, then the lock gets released. If you go here and you click on log off, then the lock gets released. But you just simply go and close your browser, then the lock doesn't get released. So that is the reason this expiry time of 30 minutes is important. So it will say after 30 minutes, it will automatically release the case. Okay. Even if the same person, let's say I have opened a case, I just closed the browser window. Again, I took a new session and I'm trying to access the same case. Pega throws me an error message saying that release lock. This is locked by another session, release lock. Why does it throw that? It's me who has logged earlier and it's me who is trying to open the case again. But still, as I told you, lock is acquired for a thread. So the earlier thread is gone. Now you have opened in a new requester session, a new thread. So you have to release the lock there and acquire it here. Okay. So where do you specify this 30 minutes of locking time? Where is it configured? It's configured in your case type rule. So if you go to your case type rule, and this is my case type rule. Oh, sorry. This is my case type rule. Okay, so you have this option. Default is 30 minutes. If you want, you can change it. This is the place where you specify what is the lock time. Sometimes in real time, yes, we need more than 30 minutes. Sometimes we do it. We increase the time or we might decrease the time. Okay, then what is this radio button? Default and optimistic. There are two types of locking in Pega. From Pega 7, this optimistic locking was introduced. In earlier versions of Pega, we had this default locking. So why was this introduced? What is the necessity to have this? In normal locking, what happens is like only one person can work on a case at one time. So there's certain projects where not maybe not both the person would like to edit the case at the same time. One person would like to have a read-only view of the case. One person would like to have an editable view of the case. So more than one person would like to look at the case for some reason. They're just reviewers. Other persons would like to work on the case. So until and unless if a person releases the lock, the other person can't access, then it's difficult for them. So they thought like one person should have editable access and others should have at least read-only access. So with that concept, optimistic locking came into the picture. What happens in optimistic locking is more than one person can open the same case at the same time. Both of them can enter the data, okay? But whoever submits the case first, their data gets committed to the DB. Excuse me once. Okay, so in that case, what happens is like both the people can access the case at the same time. Both of them will be working on the case, editing the case. But if you go and open the PRS logs table and you look at the records, you will not find a lock for neither of them. You have opened the case. I also have opened the same case. But if you come here and you see there will not be any record for it, any operator ID. Because in optimistic locking, until and unless you submit the case or you try to commit the changes to the DB, you will not acquire the lock. The case just opens in a read-only view kind of for both of you. Both of you can edit it. But whoever commits the changes first, that person will acquire the lock, commit his changes. Upon commit, upon DB commit, the lock gets automatically released. And the other person, when he tries to commit, he will get a message. His a change somewhere else has taken precedence over your changes. Can you please refresh your screen? Then this guy has to refresh the screen and then again to enter all his data and then submit. That is optimistic locking. Okay, so that is optimistic locking. So based upon your requirement, you can choose with either going with a default locking or optimistic locking. You have to choose. Now, whatever is the type of locking, end of the day, the locks are always stored on PRSys logs table. And this table is coming from system-logs class of Pega. So suppose you don't have access to production database. Let's say you want to look at a log in some case of production. You don't have access to the data table. So you can just come and click on this class and you can look at the instances. You can see this. This is the case that is logged by this person. This way you can see. Okay. And also if you want to look at your logs, what are all the cases which are logged by you currently you want to see? Just go to Designer Studio, Case Management. 1 second, here somewhere you'll find logs. Case Management, Process. Yeah, my logs, which shows all the cases which are currently logged by you, all logs, all the operators logs, which case is logged by which person. So this way also you can see the logs. You can see this. This is the case currently logged by me. Okay, so this way you can see like my logs and all logs. When you're debugging some issue in production or somewhere, you can look at the logs. And this is the way you can switch to different types of locking in your application. Okay, now in which out of the box table PR underscore sys logs, when does Pega acquire a lock? Pega acquires a lock only when you're like using this methods like obj open, open by handle. Just a second, guys. Okay, now when does Pega acquire a lock? Pega usually acquires a lock when you're trying to save some changes to the DB. So what are the methods that are used to acquire the locks? OBJ open, open by handle, refresh and lock are the methods which can acquire a lock. So when you see OBJ open, you can see this lock and release on commit. So lock means you're going to get a lock over that record, and that lock gets released only when you make a commit. Until you make a commit, the lock doesn't get released. Similarly, you will find the same option available on open by handle and refresh and lock. So there are three methods which are used to get a lock. That is the reason sometimes, when you're monitoring your logs in production, if you see the log cannot be acquired for this case, kind of log messages usually come, which means that you're trying to process a case in some activity or some agent or some service, and that is not getting the lock over the case. So in such cases, you have to make sure like you use obj refresh and lock, or if you're using any of these methods, please make sure you enable that lock and release on commit. Otherwise, you'll find such sort of logs. The cases are not able to, like the activity is not able to get a lock over your case, and you'll find such logs in the logs, log messages in the logs. Okay, so make sure you use this method to get the lock over the cases before you process them. So these are the out of the box methods. Similarly, you also have some out of the box activities as well. Sometimes even you will end up with scenarios where you have to manually try to acquire the lock over the case. Like then you start using out of the box activities like work lock, okay, or you can also use something like acquire lock, acquire work object. Okay, acquire work object either in work dash or assign dash. We use this kind of activities to get a lock over the work object. Then you have some out of the box functions to check whether the lock is present on a case or not. There's a function, let me check that. There's an out of the box function which tells you whether you have a just before you process some data on the case, maybe you want to check whether the lock is present or not. So in such cases, we start checking for that functions. I'm not recollecting the name of it, so I'm just trying to check the function. Yeah, this one is page locked. So with this, you can check whether the page is locked or not. So such kind of methods and out of the box activities functions are available to check whether the page is locked or not, whether you have a lock or not. You can check with the help of these. Okay. Yeah, we discussed all these things, optimistic locking. We saw about my locks and all locks. Okay. So this is about locking in Pega. And to improve the performance of the application, it's always good you handle the locks properly when you're trying to modify the data using agents, services, all these things, whatever activity you're using, make sure you are handling the locks properly. Otherwise, you might end up with data loss. Okay, so that's it about locking.